The woman started yelling in the middle of the concert, not during intermission, not at the end. It was exactly at the moment when no one, absolutely no one, should say anything. For a second, nobody knew how to react. Some people thought it needed to be stopped immediately. Others froze, waiting for someone to make a decision. André Rieu heard and did nothing. The music continued for a few seconds, but something had already spiraled out of control. Because after that scream, the problem was no longer the woman. It was what the entire hall was about to do. The curious thing is that almost no one remembers exactly what she said, but everyone remembers the silence that came after. A silence that was not in the program, and that completely changed the course of that night. That night had been planned to be predictable. The audience arrived on time, took their seats calmly, leafed through the program, and waited in silence. It was the kind of concert where everything happens exactly as expected, from the first chord to the last applause. André Rieu was already used to this type of environment: full halls, attentive audiences, precise organization, nothing off script. For many, this was the definition of a successful concert. Absolute control, contained emotion, respect for the invisible rules that no one needs to explain. The orchestra was positioned, the acoustics perfect, the lights adjusted to the right tone. Backstage, the team watched calmly. There was no nervousness, there were no apparent risks. Everything indicated another solid, correct presentation without surprises. When André entered the stage, he was greeted with polite applause. Not exaggerated, not cold, just enough. He raised the bow, waited for complete silence to settle, and began the music. The first notes spread through the hall with precision. The audience listened attentively, as always. Nothing indicated that this night would be different from so many others, but concerts do not change because of the stage. They change because of what happens outside it. Somewhere in the audience, someone was breathing differently. Someone was not just following with their eyes. Someone felt more than protocol allowed them to demonstrate. André continued playing, focused, conducting the music with the same serenity as always. The hall remained organized, silent, perfectly behaved, until suddenly a single voice broke through everything that seemed solid, and from that instant on, nothing more that night would be exactly as planned. Chapter 1. For a few seconds, no one knew exactly how to react. Not because they had not heard, but because it simply did not fit in that place. In concerts like that, interruptions do not happen, and when they do, they are resolved quickly, almost without the audience noticing. This time was different. The woman had screamed clearly, audible enough to cut through the music and reach the front rows. It was not an uncontrolled sound. It did not seem like confusion. It was intentional, and that made everything more uncomfortable. Some people turned immediately, trying to locate her. Others kept their eyes fixed on the stage, as if ignoring it was the best way to make it disappear. A couple exchanged quick glances. A gentleman frowned. No one said anything. The music continued. André Rieu did not interrupt the movement of the bow. He did not turn his body. He made no gesture toward the audience. For those watching closely, that detail was strange. Normally, any minimal distraction would be enough to break concentration, but André seemed aware of something the rest of the hall was still trying to process. On the side, members of the organization moved discreetly. They did not run, they did not gesture, but they were alert. The silent question was the same for everyone. Do we intervene now or wait a few more seconds? The woman did not scream again, but she also did not retreat. She remained there, visibly emotional, breathing irregularly, as if fighting against something that had been building up for a long time. For those watching her closely, it was clear. This was not a protest. It was a necessity. The music advanced. And the more it advanced, the more evident it became that that scream had created an invisible fissure. The hall was still silent, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was tense, expectant, fragile. André heard everything, every different breath, every subtle change in the environment. Still, he did nothing. And it was precisely this absence of immediate reaction that left everyone uneasy. Because at that instant, no one knew if the concert would continue normally or if it was about to spiral completely out of control. The orchestra members exchanged brief glances among themselves. Some wondered if they should stop. Others focused intensely on their instruments, as if pretending nothing had happened would make it true. Thomas, the first violinist, kept his eyes fixed on André, waiting for any signal, any subtle indication of what to do next, but André gave no signal. He continued conducting with the same precision, the same apparent calm as if that interruption had not reached him. Yet those who knew him well could detect something different in his posture. There was a slight adjustment in his shoulders, a minimal change in the way he held the bow. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but present. In the third row, a man leaned toward his wife and whispered something. She shook her head, uncomfortable. Around them, other audience members began to shift in their seats, not because they were losing interest in the music, but because the tension was becoming unbearable. The woman who had screamed remained in the same position. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap now, her knuckles white from the pressure. She was not looking at the stage. She was looking down, as if trying to disappear into herself, but her breathing was still irregular, still fighting against something. A security guard appeared at the end of her row. He did not approach immediately. He just stood there, watching, evaluating. His hand rested on the radio at his belt, ready to call for backup if necessary, but he too seemed uncertain. This was not a typical disturbance. There was no aggression, no threat, just emotion spilling over in a place where emotion was supposed to stay contained. The music reached a softer passage. The notes became gentler, more delicate, and in that moment of relative quiet, another sound emerged. It was not a scream this time, it was a sob, barely audible but unmistakable to those sitting nearby. The woman had covered her mouth with her hand, trying to suppress it, but the sound escaped anyway. A raw, genuine expression of something she could no longer hold inside. More heads turned. More whispers spread through the rows. The discomfort was growing, spreading like ripples in water. André heard the sob. His fingers tightened slightly on the bow. For the first time that evening, there was a barely perceptible hesitation in his playing, just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people would not notice. But it was there. He had a choice to make. He could stop. He could acknowledge what was happening. He could address it directly, bring it into the open, take control of the situation in the way everyone expected him to, or he could continue. The security guard took a step closer to the woman's row. Other staff members were now positioned at various points around the hall, all watching, all waiting for direction. The stage manager stood in the wings, hand pressed to his earpiece, speaking in urgent whispers to the technical crew. The woman's shoulders began to shake. She was crying now, no longer trying to hide it. The people around her did not know where to look. Some stared straight ahead with rigid determination. Others glanced at her with a mixture of sympathy and irritation, and still the music continued. André raised his arm slightly, cueing the orchestra for the next phrase. The strings swelled, the melody lifted, and in that lift, something unexpected happened. The woman's sobbing began to synchronize with the music, not intentionally, not performed, but the rhythm of her breathing, the cadence of her grief, somehow aligned with the notes flowing from the stage. It was as if the music was giving shape to what she was feeling, providing a container for emotions that had nowhere else to go. André felt it, he knew it, and in that moment, he made his decision. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not signal to security. Instead, he opened the music slightly. He gave it more space, more room to breathe. He created a pocket of permission without saying a word. The security guard hesitated, his hand still on the radio. The stage manager waited for the command to intervene. The audience held its collective breath, and the woman continued to cry, her tears now falling freely, her whole body shaking with the release of something long held back. But she was not screaming anymore. She was not disrupting. She was simply letting the music do what music has always done for those brave enough to let it in. The question now was not whether someone would stop her. The question was what everyone else in that hall would do when they realized that the rules they thought were unbreakable had just been quietly set aside, and no one, absolutely no one, could predict what would happen next. What bothered people most was not the scream. It was what came after. The entire hall seemed suspended in a strange interval, as if everyone was waiting for an automatic correction of reality. A security guard would appear. A gesture would come from the stage. The music would be interrupted. Something should happen to return that night to its axis. Nothing happened. André Rieu continued playing, but not in the same way. For those watching closely, there was an almost imperceptible difference. The tempo was slightly more open. The notes breathed more. It was not a mistake. It was a choice. The woman remained silent now. The moment of the scream had passed, but the emotion had not. She held her hands tightly, her body leaning forward as if being pulled by the music. Some people around her began to notice that she did not seem out of control. On the contrary, She seemed completely within it. Backstage, the organization exchanged quick glances. No one wanted to be the first to act. Interrupting now could make things worse. Ignoring it could seem like negligence. Each second increased the feeling that any decision would be definitive. On stage, André felt the room. He had always felt it. Audiences speak, not with words, but with breathing, with posture, with silence. And that silence was different from anything he had ever heard. He knew he had options. He could stop. He could signal the team. He could regain absolute control. But he also knew that if he did that, something would be lost, something that would not repeat itself. The music continued, and with it, something began to reorganize within the hall. Some people stopped observing the woman and returned to closing their eyes. Others, curiously, began to listen more intensely than before, as if the scream had broken an invisible barrier and allowed the music to enter more deeply. André did not look directly at the audience, but he adjusted the bow once more. A minimal gesture, subtle, just enough to create space. And it was in that space, small, almost invisible, that something new began to form. It was not collective yet. It was not clear yet, but it could no longer be undone, because at that moment the music no longer belonged only to the stage, and André had chosen not to prevent that. The orchestra members were beginning to sense the shift as well. Cellos sustained their notes a fraction longer. Violins softened their attacks. The brass section held back, creating negative space where before there had been fullness. None of this was discussed. None of it was planned. But musicians who have played together long enough develop an almost telepathic awareness of collective intention. They were following André's lead, even though he had not explicitly changed anything. In the audience, the woman's crying had quieted to occasional shudders. Her hands were still pressed to her face, but the urgency had passed. What remained was something gentler, something like relief. An elderly man in the row behind her leaned forward slightly. He did not touch her, did not speak, but his presence shifted, becoming less judgmental, more present. His wife noticed and reached over to squeeze his hand. That small gesture seemed to ripple outward. A young woman 3 rows over, who had been rigid with discomfort, let her shoulders drop. A teenager who had been texting his friends put his phone away. A couple who had been whispering their disapproval fell silent and simply listened. The music was doing something none of them had expected. It was not covering up what had happened. It was not pretending the disruption had not occurred. Instead, it was somehow incorporating it, weaving it into the fabric of the evening in a way that made the whole experience more textured, more real. But not everyone was comfortable with this. In the box seats to the right, a woman in an expensive dress stood abruptly. She gathered her coat and purse with sharp, angry movements. Her companion tried to stop her, reaching for her arm, but she pulled away. She made her way to the aisle and walked out, her heels clicking loudly against the floor in deliberate counterpoint to the music. Several heads turned to watch her go. The disruption was now coming from a different source, but André did not react to this either. He had learned long ago that you cannot control how people respond to vulnerability. You can only create space for it, and trust that those who need it will find their way in. The woman who had left slammed the door behind her. The sound echoed through the hall like a judgment, but it also had an unexpected effect. It clarified things. It drew a line. Those who remained had made a choice, conscious or not, to stay with whatever was unfolding. The music shifted again. The melody became more insistent now, more urgent. The strings picked up intensity. The percussion entered with soft, heartbeat-like rhythms. The brass added warmth without overwhelming. And then something remarkable happened. The woman who had screamed, who had cried, slowly lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. But there was something else there, too. Something that had not been there before. Recognition. She was not just hearing the music anymore. She was inside it, and it was inside her. The boundary between listener and listened to had dissolved. A man several rows away felt his own eyes beginning to sting. He blinked rapidly, trying to push it back, but it was too late. A tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. A woman in the balcony pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. She had come to this concert because her daughter had insisted. Classical music was not really her thing, but now she understood why her daughter had been so persistent. This was not about perfection. It was not about technical excellence or proper behavior. It was about connection, about being human in a world that too often demanded we pretend otherwise. The security guard who had been ready to escort the crying woman out quietly stepped back. He had seen enough disruptions in his career to know the difference between chaos and catharsis. This was the latter, and intervening now would be cruel. The stage manager in the wings lowered his hand from his earpiece. He nodded to the technical crew. "Stand down, let it continue." André felt all of this without seeing any of it directly. He felt it in the way the air in the hall had changed, in the way the acoustics seemed different now, as if the space itself had opened up. The audience was breathing differently, sitting differently, being differently. The music approached a crescendo, not the planned one from the original score, but an organic build that emerged from the moment itself. The orchestra leaned into it, each musician contributing to something larger than themselves, and as the sound swelled and filled every corner of the concert hall, people began to realize that what they were experiencing was not just a performance, it was a shared moment of profound humanity, the kind that happens so rarely that when it does, it changes everyone who witnesses it. But the night was not over yet. The crescendo had to peak, and when it did, something else would be revealed, something no one in that hall was prepared for. Because what had started with one woman's inability to contain her emotion was about to become something much larger, something that would test not just André's skill as a musician, but his understanding of what music could actually do when it was allowed to be more than entertainment. The bow moved, the notes climbed, the moment approached, and everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would break open next. At first it was almost imperceptible, nothing that could be pointed out clearly, just small signs that something within the hall was no longer still. Someone breathed more deeply than before. Another person adjusted their posture in the chair. A woman in the front row brought her hand to her chest, as if caught off guard by an unexpected memory. The music continued, but now it circulated differently, not just from the stage to the audience, but among the people. The sound seemed to find less resistance, as if the scream had opened a passage no one knew existed. The woman who had screamed remained silent, but she was not absent. Her face showed relief mixed with apprehension, like someone who had just crossed a limit and still did not know if she would be punished or understood. Some people began to look less at her and more at themselves. The initial discomfort gave way to another sensation, harder to name. It was not approval. It was not disapproval. It was identification. In the side corridors, the organization remained alert. But now there was hesitation. Intervening at that moment seemed almost invasive. Something was happening that did not fit the protocols, but also did not seem wrong. On stage, André Rieu felt this clearly. He was no longer just conducting the orchestra. He was conducting a delicate emotional space. Each choice needed to be minimal. Any excess could break what was beginning to form. And then something else unexpected happened. It was not a new scream. It was not applause. It was a low sound, almost shy, coming from a different point in the hall. A voice, not loud enough to impose itself, but clear enough to be heard by those paying attention. Some people turned slowly, trying to understand if they had really heard that. Others felt their bodies react before their minds, as if recognizing something familiar. The music did not stop. André did not react. But now, it was no longer just one woman, and at that instant, everyone began to realize that what was being born there could not be contained with a simple request for silence. The voice came from somewhere in the middle section. A man, perhaps in his 50s, had begun to hum along with the melody, not loudly, not performatively, just a quiet accompaniment, as if he could not help himself. The woman sitting next to him tensed. She touched his arm, a gentle warning to stop, but he did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and chose to continue anyway. The humming grew slightly stronger, more confident. Another voice joined from the opposite side of the hall. This one belonged to a younger woman, somewhere in her 20s. She was not humming, she was singing actual words, though so softly that only those immediately around her could make them out. Her eyes were closed, tears ran down her face, but she was smiling. The people near her did not know how to respond. Some looked annoyed, others curious. A few seemed moved by the sight of such unguarded emotion. The security team exchanged glances. This was beyond their training. One disturbance they could handle, but multiple people responding emotionally across the entire venue, there was no protocol for that. André continued to conduct, but his awareness had expanded to encompass the entire space. He could feel the hall fragmenting into different camps. Those who wanted order restored, those who were curious about what was emerging, and those who were beginning to feel something shift inside themselves. The music he was conducting had always contained these emotions, but until tonight, they had been theoretical. aesthetic, something to appreciate from a safe distance. Now they were becoming immediate, personal, unavoidable. A middle-aged man in the orchestra section cleared his throat several times, trying to suppress something rising in his chest. His wife gripped his hand tightly. She understood. She had lost her mother 3 months ago, and this piece had been played at the funeral. The memory was overwhelming her, but she welcomed it. She needed it. More voices began to emerge. Not many, perhaps a dozen across the entire hall, but enough to create a texture underneath the orchestral sound. Some hummed, some sang quietly. Some simply made soft sounds of release, like pressure valves opening. The woman who had first screamed opened her eyes. She looked around, seeing others now expressing what she had felt, and something changed in her face. The shame that had been there, the self-consciousness, began to dissolve. She was not alone anymore. An elderly gentleman in the balcony stood slowly. He did not leave. He just stood there, one hand on the railing, the other pressed to his heart. His whole body was shaking. His grandson, sitting beside him, stood too, and put an arm around his shoulders. The music swelled. André gave it more space, more permission. The orchestra responded, creating room for all these human sounds that were weaving themselves into the performance. But not everyone was accepting this transformation. A woman in the 5th row stood up and spoke loudly enough for many to hear. "This is inappropriate. This is a concert hall, not a therapy session." A few people murmured in agreement. One man clapped briefly, supporting her objection. The woman looked around, expecting more support, expecting order to be restored, but André did not stop. The woman who had spoken out looked toward the stage, waiting for acknowledgement, for someone in authority to validate her complaint. When none came, her face flushed with anger. She grabbed her belongings and moved toward the aisle, her movements sharp with indignation. As she walked out, she passed the crying woman from earlier. For a moment, their eyes met. The departing woman's expression was hard, judgmental, but the crying woman did not look away. She held the gaze with a quiet dignity that said she had every right to be there, to feel what she felt. The door closed behind the angry woman with a decisive thud, and in the wake of her departure, something shifted again. Those who remained now understood that they were choosing to stay, choosing to be part of whatever this was becoming. The ambiguity was gone. You were either in or out. More people made their choice. A teenage boy who had been scrolling through his phone earlier put it away and actually listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in his life. A businessman who had attended out of obligation felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. A retired teacher closed her eyes and let herself remember why she had first fallen in love with music 50 years ago. The voices in the audience grew slightly bolder, still not overwhelming, still not a full chorus, but present, undeniable, real. André made another subtle adjustment. He was no longer conducting a planned performance. He was facilitating a living moment. The orchestra understood. They had crossed a threshold together, and there was no going back. The melody reached a turning point, a place where the music could go in several different directions. In a normal performance, André would have followed the score. But this was no longer a normal performance. He chose a different path, not dramatically different, but softer, more open, more inviting. And in that opening, something broke free. A woman in the back row stood up, not to leave, to see better, to be more fully present. Another person stood, then another. Not everyone, but enough to create a new energy in the room. The music surrounded them all now, these people who had come as strangers, as individuals, and were becoming something else. Not quite a community, not yet, but moving toward it, moving toward a shared experience that none of them would be able to fully explain to anyone who had not been there. The security guards relaxed their postures. They were no longer guards, they were witnesses. The stage manager stopped trying to manage. He let go of control and simply experienced. And André, standing before his orchestra, understood that this was what music had always been meant to do, not to be consumed, not to be judged, but to create space for humans to be fully human, with all their messiness, all their vulnerability, all their need to be seen and heard and held. The question now was not whether this would continue. It would. It had to. It had its own momentum now. The question was how far it would go, how deep, how transformative. And as the music moved toward its next phase, everyone in that hall knew they were about to find out. The second voice was no longer as timid as the first, still contained, but confident enough not to seem accidental. It emerged from another row, another point in the hall, as if it had crossed the space through an invisible path. Two voices, separated, but connected by the same melody. The discomfort returned, now different. It was no longer embarrassment. It was uncertainty. People began to realize that this was not an isolated incident. Something was organizing itself without permission. André felt it immediately. His body reacted before thought. He adjusted the tempo with extreme delicacy, creating a stable, almost protective base. He did not accelerate. He did not emphasize. He just sustained. The woman who had screamed at the beginning closed her eyes. Now she no longer needed to force anything. What she had carried alone for a few seconds was beginning to be shared, and that changed everything. In the audience, other people began to sing at an almost inaudible volume, not as a choir, but like someone testing a limit. Some stopped immediately, frightened by their own impulse. Others continued, overcoming hesitation. The organization no longer moved. Intervening now would be interrupting something that clearly was not chaotic. It was sensitive, fragile, and paradoxically extremely powerful. The music no longer came only from the stage. It spread in layers, adding imperfect voices, breaths out of exact time, emotions that followed no score. And yet, everything made sense. André kept his gaze down. He did not seek approval. He did not command. He knew that at that point, any explicit gesture could be interpreted as authorization, and this needed to continue being the hall's choice, not his. More voices emerged. Now it was not possible to count. It was no longer possible to identify who started. The sound gained body, filling the space in a way no orchestra alone could achieve. The audience was no longer watching. They were participating. And in that silent instant between one musical phrase and another, it became clear to everyone that this night could no longer return to what it was before. The hall had crossed a limit, and no one there seemed willing to cross back. The transformation was now undeniable. What had begun as disruption had become integration. The voices were not competing with the orchestra, they were completing it. A father in the 10th row felt his chest tighten as he recognized the melody from his daughter's wedding years ago. She had moved to another country, and they had not spoken in months over a misunderstanding neither could quite remember anymore. The music was pulling that pain to the surface, and he let it come. His wife noticed his expression and reached for his hand. She squeezed it gently, understanding without words what he was experiencing. They had been married for 32 years. She knew his silences. Across the aisle, a young medical student who had not cried since her mother's diagnosis 6 months earlier felt the first tear break through. She had been holding everything together, being strong for everyone. But here in this anonymous darkness, surrounded by strangers who were somehow not strangers anymore, she could finally let go. The man beside her, a complete stranger, offered her a tissue without looking at her, without making her self-conscious. Just a simple gesture of human kindness. These small moments of connection were happening throughout the hall. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but enough. Enough to change the fundamental nature of the evening. André could feel it in the way the orchestra was responding. The musicians were no longer simply executing notes on a page. They were listening, truly listening, to the space around them and adjusting accordingly. The principal cellist added a slight ritardando that was not in the score but felt absolutely right. The flutist breathed with the room instead of against it. This was ensemble playing at its highest level, not because of technical perfection, but because of emotional presence. The voices in the audience began to find each other, not in unison but in harmony. Someone singing in the upper balcony found a natural counter-melody to someone in the orchestra section. It was not planned, it was not rehearsed. It simply happened, the way music happens when people stop trying to control it and start trusting it. A woman who had been paralyzed by grief since her husband's passing 2 years ago opened her mouth and let sound emerge for the first time in months. She had not sung since the funeral, had not wanted to. But now the music was pulling it out of her and she surrendered to it. The security guard who had earlier been ready to remove the crying woman now found his own eyes wet. He had worked hundreds of concerts, had seen thousands of performances, but he had never seen anything like this, never felt anything like this. In the wings, the stage crew stood motionless. The lighting director had his hand on the board, ready to adjust, but he did not. Whatever was supposed to happen according to the lighting plot no longer mattered. What was happening in the hall was its own light. The music approached another peak, but this time, when it arrived, It was not just the orchestra that peaked, it was everyone. All those voices, all those hearts, all those private griefs and joys and longings rising together in a moment of collective release. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps 15. Time had become fluid, unreliable, and when it passed, when the sound began to settle, there was a shift in the room's atmosphere. Not a return to normal. There was no normal to return to, but a gentle descent, like coming back to earth after flight. People began to look at each other, really look, seeing not types or categories, but individuals, humans who hurt and hope and try to make sense of impossible things. The woman who had screamed first, whose moment of vulnerability had started all of this, felt someone touch her shoulder gently. She turned to find an older woman smiling at her through her own tears. "Thank you," the older woman whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to feel." The younger woman nodded, unable to speak, but understanding completely. André lowered his arms slightly, bringing the orchestra to a gentler dynamic. The music was still playing, but softer now, making room for the quiet conversations beginning to happen, the small acknowledgements, the tiny bridges being built between people who had been strangers 20 minutes ago. A teenager leaned over to his father and said something the father had been waiting years to hear. An estranged couple reached for each other's hands at the same moment. A lonely widow realized she was not as alone as she had thought. These moments were not grand, they were not dramatic, but they were real. And in their realness, they were powerful beyond measure. The music continued its gentle descent, guiding everyone back from the peak, but not abandoning them there. André knew the importance of this phase. The ecstasy was important, but so was the return, so was the integration, so was the quiet that comes after the storm. The voices in the audience faded gradually, not abruptly, not with shame or embarrassment, but naturally, like the tide going out. Some people continued humming softly to themselves. Others simply sat in silence, processing what had just moved through them. And through it all, André conducted, not controlling, not directing, but holding, creating a container strong enough for all this feeling, spacious enough for all this humanity. The orchestra played with a gentleness that was almost tenderness. They understood that what they were doing now was just as important as the crescendo. They were helping people land safely after flight. Slowly, very slowly, the music moved toward resolution. But everyone in the hall knew that nothing had truly been resolved. Nothing had been fixed or solved. But something had been acknowledged. Something had been witnessed. Something had been allowed to exist, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes, being seen in your full humanity, being allowed to feel without judgment, being part of something larger than yourself, is all the resolution anyone needs. The music approached its natural ending, but this time no one was eager for it to be over. No one was checking their watches or preparing to leave. They wanted to stay in this space as long as possible, wanted to hold on to this feeling before the world outside required them to put their armor back on. André understood this too, so he took his time. No rushing, no urgency, just a gentle guiding toward closure while honoring everything that had opened. And as the final phrases began, everyone in that hall took a breath and prepared themselves for whatever would come next. Because they all knew somehow that leaving this room would mean leaving something behind, something precious, something that could never be fully recaptured, but also something they would carry with them forever. The last note did not end alone. It dissolved slowly, mixed with the voices that still lingered in the air, as if the entire hall had difficulty accepting that this moment needed to end. There was no abrupt cut. There was no clear signal, just a gradual emptying. When the sound finally ceased, no one applauded immediately. The silence that followed was different from all the others that night. It was not tension. It was not expectation. It was recognition. André lowered the bow carefully. He did not turn immediately. He remained there for a few seconds, motionless, respecting what had happened without trying to capture it. He knew that this type of moment cannot be explained, cannot be repeated, and does not belong to those who try to control it. In the audience, some people were still breathing deeply, as if slowly returning to their own bodies. Others looked at each other in silence, sharing something that needed no words. The woman who had screamed at the beginning kept her hands over her face. She was not crying. She was just there, like someone who had finally been heard. Then someone began to applaud, then another, and little by little, the entire hall stood up. It was not an explosion. It was long, sustained, deep. André turned to the audience, and made a slight bow of his head. No grand gesture, no speech, just a silent thank you. He knew that any words would break something that was still alive. Backstage, the organization remained silent. There were no protocols for that. There was no report that could explain what had happened, only the certainty that this night would not be remembered as just another well-executed concert. When the audience began to leave the hall, conversations were quiet. Some people were still humming parts of the piece among themselves, almost like a whisper. Others left without saying anything, but with transformed faces. And the woman who had screamed, she left without drawing attention, without directed applause, without being pointed out. But everyone knew that without that first sound out of place, none of this would have happened. Because that night, André Rieu did not do anything grandiose. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He did not control. He simply let the music do what it always knew how to do when someone has the courage to break the right silence. And that was what no one expected. But the story did not end when people walked out the doors. In the lobby, clusters of audience members stood talking instead of rushing to their cars. Strangers who would normally pass each other without acknowledgement now stood in circles, sharing what they had experienced. A businessman found himself describing his feelings to a young artist. A retired nurse listened intently as a college student spoke about his anxiety. Boundaries that usually separated people had become permeable. The woman who had screamed stood near a pillar, not hiding exactly, but not seeking attention either. Several people approached her throughout the next 20 minutes. None of them accused her. None of them made her feel ashamed. Instead, they thanked her. They told her she had given them permission to feel something they had been suppressing. One elderly man took her hand and simply held it for a moment, his eyes saying everything his voice could not. Outside, the night air was cool and clear. People stood on the steps of the concert hall, reluctant to disperse. Some exchanged phone numbers. Others simply stood together in comfortable silence, not ready to let go of the connection they had found. André remained backstage for longer than usual. He sat alone in his dressing room, the bow still in his hand, thinking about what had transpired. In his decades of performing, he had created countless beautiful moments. But tonight had been different. Tonight, he had not created anything. He had simply not prevented what needed to happen. There was a soft knock on his door. It was Thomas, the first violinist. "That was extraordinary," Thomas said quietly. "I have never experienced anything like that." André nodded. "Neither have I." "Did you know it was going to happen?" "No, but I knew something wanted to." They sat together in silence for a few moments. "Some people will complain," Thomas said eventually. "Some people will say it was unprofessional." "Yes," André agreed. "They will." "Do you regret it?" André considered the question carefully. Then he smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. Not for a single second. In the weeks that followed, the concert became something of a legend. Videos that audience members had recorded on their phones went viral, though none of them quite captured what it had felt like to be there. Articles were written. Some praised André for his wisdom and sensitivity. Others criticized him for allowing disorder and emotion to overtake artistic discipline. He read none of them. He did not need external validation or criticism. He knew what had happened in that hall. He knew that for a few brief minutes, music had done what it was always meant to do: create space for humans to remember their shared humanity. The woman who had screamed never spoke publicly about that night. She did not give interviews or write essays, but those who knew her noticed a change. She walked differently, spoke differently, as if some weight she had been carrying had been set down. She returned to concerts after that, but she always sat in the same seat if she could, and sometimes, when the music moved her, she would close her eyes and let herself feel without fear, because she had learned that night that vulnerability was not weakness. It was the deepest form of courage. The other audience members carried the experience with them in various ways. The father who had thought of his estranged daughter called her the next morning. They talked for 3 hours. The young medical student told her mother she loved her, something she had been too scared to say while facing the possibility of loss. The grieving widow joined a support group and began to sing again. None of these things were dramatic transformations. They were small, quiet changes, but they rippled outward, affecting not just the individuals, but everyone those individuals touched. André continued to perform, of course. That was his life, his calling. But he never tried to recreate what had happened that night. He understood that magic cannot be manufactured. It can only be allowed. In subsequent concerts, he conducted with the same technical precision, the same musical excellence. But there was a subtle difference now, a slightly more open quality, a willingness to listen not just to the orchestra, but to the room itself, to sense what wanted to emerge and to make space for it. Not every performance became what that one had been. Most remained traditional, beautifully executed concerts, but occasionally, when the conditions were right, when the audience was open, when the music found its way into the cracks in people's armor, something special would happen, not the same as that night, but real in its own way. And André learned to recognize those moments and to honor them without trying to force them or control them. Years later, musicians who had been in the orchestra that night would tell the story to younger players. They would try to describe what it felt like to be part of something that transcended performance and became communion. Most of the younger musicians would listen politely, but not fully understand. A few would get it, would feel it resonate with something they sensed was possible in music, but had never quite experienced. The concert hall itself seemed changed after that night. The staff noticed it. There was a different quality to the space, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened within them. Other performers who played there in subsequent months sometimes commented on it. There was something special about this room, they would say. Something that made people more willing to be present, more willing to feel. The woman who had screamed eventually moved to a different city. But before she left, she returned to the concert hall one afternoon when it was empty. She sat in her seat and closed her eyes and remembered. Not just the music, but the moment when she realized she was not alone in her feeling, when she understood that her vulnerability had created permission for others. She whispered thank you into the empty space. And whether anyone heard it or not did not matter. She had said it. She had acknowledged the gift that night had given her. As time passed, the specific details of that evening began to blur in people's memories. They could not quite remember what piece had been playing, could not recall exactly how long it lasted, could not pinpoint the precise moment when everything shifted, but they all remembered how it felt. They remembered the sense of connection, the permission to be fully human, the understanding that music was not just sound but a bridge between isolated hearts. And whenever they heard that particular piece of music again, no matter where they were or what else was happening in their lives, they would pause, they would remember, and for just a moment they would feel that connection again. André Rieu continued to perform for many more years. He played for presidents and ordinary people. He performed in grand halls and small venues. He created countless moments of beauty and joy, but he never forgot the night when a woman screamed in his concert and he chose to do nothing. The night when doing nothing was actually the most important thing he could do. The night when he learned that sometimes the greatest artistry is knowing when to step aside and let music be what it has always meant to be. Not a product to be consumed, not a commodity to be judged, but a living force that connects us to ourselves and to each other. That night, music remembered its original purpose, and everyone in that hall remembered theirs: to be human, to feel, to connect, to witness each other's pain and joy without judgment, to understand that we are all struggling and all trying and all deserving of compassion. The woman who screamed gave everyone that gift, and André Rieu honored it by trusting that music was strong enough to hold it. That was his true genius that night, not his technical skill, though that was considerable, not his musicianship, though that was profound, but his trust, his willingness to surrender control, his courage to allow the unknown, and in that allowance, something sacred happened, something that could never be fully captured or explained or repeated, something that lived only in the hearts of those who were there, and that was exactly as it should be.